COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inequities in global health like never before, putting this year's Grand Challenges annual meeting more firmly in the spotlight. Originally scheduled to be here in New Delhi, the meeting was held virtually for the first time and was co-hosted by the Government of India and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The objective is to create a unique partnership between the government and the Gates Foundation that works to encourage research and development to address unmet scientific, medical, public health and development challenges that would improve the lives of all. In his keynote address, Prime Minister Modi said that India is working on a well-established vaccine delivery system and the country has the capacity to produce a vaccine at low cost for the world. That view was echoed by Bill Gates, who said that India's research and manufacturing capacity are critical for fighting the virus. In this special edition of Global Dialogues, I'm joined by Mark Suzman, the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Mark, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18 on the Global Dialogues. Unfortunate that we couldn't do this in person and we couldn't have the Global Challenges event here in New Delhi. It happened virtually. But Mark, let's talk about some of the lessons. You know, Bill spoke about how COVID has brought together governments, it's brought together policymakers, scientists, but he also addressed the fact that this entire community and collaboration that has come together to deal with the pandemic has also failed, and we haven't learned the lessons from the past. What are the most glaring inequities that we continue to face?
Yes, well, there's good and bad. You know, the bad is that really the world and nearly every country could and should have prepared better. It was not a huge surprise that we are facing a global pandemic. Many people, including Bill, have warned for years that this was a likely predictable threat and that we needed to put in place much more comprehensive sort of research and development to prepare for what could be coming through, so we would be ready quickly to respond and develop vaccines and other new products. That said, while we were caught short in practice for this one, it has been amazing to see how the world has responded incredibly quickly. And India has been very much at the forefront of a lot of that, both through the direct response and through the capacity of the research and development community in India and the strong private sector. And so even if we were late, I think the nature of the response now and what the Grand Challenges meeting this week has been highlighting is there's been unprecedented scientific collaboration to help us address the current crisis and make sure we are never faced in the same situation again.
Yes, that certainly is the hope that we're never in this situation again. But Mark, let's talk about what we've also seen, which is the unprecedented speed with which we're moving towards vaccine development. You know, there are all kinds of estimates, from the possibility of an early use authorization that Pfizer is hoping for maybe in November to, you know, perhaps in the first quarter of next year. We've got 9 vaccines in final stages of development. You're working with many. What's your best estimate on when we're likely to see the vaccine out in a market?
Yes, well, first, it's important to remember that normally developing a vaccine for any product takes at least a decade. So the fact that we're talking about this possibility within less than a year is absolutely unprecedented, incredibly impressive, and a tribute to the scientists and the companies working on these issues. That said, we are relatively optimistic. As you say, there are hundreds of different vaccines under potential development, but really we're down to half a dozen to a dozen that are looking pretty close, that are getting near the end of phase 2 or phase 3 trials, which are the trials where you test their safety and efficacy. And it's quite possible we may have, as you say, emergency approval by regulators, global regulators like the US FDA and others, by the end of this year. But in general, we are cautiously confident that the first quarter of next year is a good target for the first wave of vaccines to come through. But the first wave of vaccines doesn't mean it's a cure-all. We still don't know how effective they'll be. We're not quite sure how difficult to manufacture and distribute. But that's an important step, but it's not the only step.
Yes, it's an important step, not the only step. So your best estimate is that the first quarter of the next year is when we are likely to have some vaccines out in the market. But Mark, let's talk about the costs. And let me put this in context with the work that you're doing with Gavi and Serum Institute here in India. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has decided to fund Serum through Gavi, 300 million for 20 crore doses, the price cap of $3 per dose. Now, this is assuming that this is going to be a single-dose vaccine. Of course, the trials are still currently underway in the UK. Adar Poonawalla, the CEO of Serum, gave us a number of 80,000 crores. He believes that that is what it's going to cost the Indian government to be able to roll out the vaccine over a period of a year. Now, I don't know whether that's anywhere close to the ballpark, but what's the estimate, the expectation in terms of the costs of putting a vaccine out?
Yeah, well, there are huge uncertainties there. As you say, the deal that we've done with the Serum Institute, which is about two different products, a Novavax product, which is a US company, and an AstraZeneca product, which is a UK company, we're targeting a price of $3 a dose. But that's at the low end, and it's actually not targeting a single dose. Both of those products would likely need 2 doses to be effective. It's more expensive. Most of the products that look like they're getting ready for approval will require 2 doses. And then some of the others, you mentioned the Pfizer, which is Pfizer and BioNTech, the product which might be the first on the market. That is likely to be much more expensive. It's a complicated, newer technology. It's more difficult to manufacture. It has complicated cold chain. It needs to be transported at minus 70 degrees centigrade, which most countries and facilities aren't equipped to deal with outside of hospital settings. And that would be much, much more expensive. So governments need to plan at multiple levels. We're hoping that the product that comes through will be on the cheaper end and easier to manufacture and distribute without those cold chain problems. But some of them may be on the more expensive end. And then you start thinking about how do you triage? Maybe the first more expensive products, you might target some high-risk communities or highly important communities like healthcare workers. And then you hope for the next wave that are cheaper and easier to manufacture to distribute more widely. So at this stage, you need to plan for a lot of uncertainty. But yes, the scale, as you mentioned from Adar Poonawalla and others, is going to be unprecedented nationally and globally. The world has never done something like this.
Yes, unprecedented, certainly scale and costs perhaps as well. And it's important that you point out, Mark, that both the Novavax vaccine as well as the AstraZeneca vaccine are likely to be 2-dose vaccines and not single-dose vaccines. And that would mean, double the cost because both are capped at $3 at this point in time. Mark, let me ask you about this whole business of economic nationalism and now vaccine nationalism. And while, the Gates Foundation has said through Gavi and the COVAX alliance that the hope is that we will see an equitable distribution of the vaccine as and when one hits the market, what will be the challenges of ensuring that that is in fact a reality?
Well, we already see the challenges. The so-called vaccine nationalism is a number of countries, particularly some of the wealthier countries, have been setting up bilateral deals with the main vaccine manufacturers in anticipation of potential regulatory approval. So the United States has spent over $10 billion securing product for its population. Now, that's not all just simply for U.S. or other national countries' consumption. That money is underwriting as a kind of global public good, the research and development. But we're very focused on, as the Gates Foundation, we need the research and we need the distribution and we need it equitably. Our recent Goalkeepers report, which we put out every year around the UN General Assembly, did some modeling done by Northeastern University, which showed that if you have equitable distribution of the first 2 billion doses of a vaccine, you're likely to save twice as many lives as if the distribution is mostly focused on high-income countries. And so this is a very important thing, both at a moral level, but also in terms of getting the global economy started, because we are all interconnected and we do need to have this going out across all countries and as close to time frame as possible.
Since we're talking about costs of the vaccine as well as other drugs related to COVID-19 as well as equitable distribution, India and South Africa have moved the WTO asking that there be an easing or a suspension of IPR norms when it comes to COVID-related treatment, COVID-related vaccines. We don't know whether this is a decision that will be carried forward by the WTO, but do you believe that there is merit in that argument?
Well, I don't want to get into the sort of specific bits about, general suspensions of IPR or other issues. What we want is the goal is distribution at as wide a scale and as cheaply as possible of any successful vaccines that come through the pipeline. Now, we at the Gates Foundation have partnered with 16 of the world's biggest life sciences companies to put out a shared statement about a commitment to equitable distribution at the lowest cost possible. So it is, it's almost unheard of for the industry to say this. There is a commitment that these would be not-for-profit products. They do want their costs recouped, but they are not looking to make profit. But you still need to then raise the resources. For very poor countries, India is no longer a very poor country and is able to fund a lot of this itself. But let's think through a number of sub-Saharan African countries or others. They will need support. And part of what we've been trying to raise with the COVAX facility that you mentioned is there's a part of the COVAX facility to try to raise resources that will help essentially subsidize the purchase of these vaccines for the poorest countries. And these companies have said that they will provide that at as close to cost as possible. And so I think we already have that infrastructure in place. What we need, though, are the resources. And then we need to make sure that we have a framework that makes sure those resources are purchasing them in the same time frame that rich countries are purchasing it for their own markets. Otherwise, the risk is you wait till the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022 till you see poorer countries being able to get vaccines at scale.
Since you talked about resources and infrastructure, Mark, let me ask you about where India fits into this, because you have said that a very large portion of the COVID-19 vaccines are likely to be manufactured here in India. We just talked about the partnership with Serum, but in light of what we heard from the Prime Minister and the vision to set up this vaccine delivery system and what the Gates Foundation has been doing, spell out for us what the priorities need to be, what has already been done, and what we should now expect.
Yeah, well, remember, there is an effective global vaccine infrastructure in place that's been put in place with the support of the Gates Foundation and other countries, including India, over the last 20 years. The Gavi Vaccine Alliance has been set up exactly to provide a wide range of vaccines in a cost-effective way across poor countries. And that has led to an unprecedented decline in child mortality, a halving of global child mortality for over 10 million deaths a year to fewer than 5 million. So we have a model. The problem is that model is really aimed at birth cohorts, hundreds of millions of children, and we now need to vaccinate billions of people. And so the infrastructure that's been put in place in India, and India is the leading manufacturer with companies like the Serum Institute, which is large, but also Bharat Biotech, BioE, others, and with its domestic research capacity led by the ICMR and many of the public and private institutes, has the infrastructure in place that can be turned to addressing the COVID challenges. And that's what the Prime Minister is referring to. That's what Adar Poonawalla was referring to. And that's why we've been strongly supportive and working closely with a number of Indian institutions to see what we can do. Because it needs to be a global effort, but there's no question, both because of the size of its domestic market, but also because of the huge capacity that's been developed here over the last 20 years, that India will play an enormous global role as well.
You already do have multiple partnerships here in India, Mark. Anything more that we can expect, anything more in the works? And also, you talked about the capacity that's already in place, but to be able to deal with the unprecedented scale of this crisis, what do you envisage as being the need to enhance that capacity?
Yeah, so I think that's something that the government and partners are sort of working on as we speak. Our role is to provide, we have a lot of access as the Gates Foundation to some of the cutting edge global research and development and information and some of the best practices on how to do these things, which we share on an advisory basis with the ICMR and the DBT and NITI Aayog and other partners. But really, it's the government that's putting in place a sort of an ambitious framework for how to respond and how to support strong domestic companies like Serum and others that are doing this important work. In terms of our own partnerships, yes, we have a number of ongoing discussions underway. A lot of it will depend in real time on which of these vaccines and other products, because remember, it's not just vaccines. We're trying to also focus on diagnostics and therapeutics, the so-called treatments, because those are critically important to tackle the COVID crisis as well. And so across all of those fronts, we're looking both at where there are individual deals and partnerships that might make sense, but also where we can come together collectively, like through the COVAX partnership, which is this partnership that now has over 150 countries, including India, a combination of countries willing to sort of self-finance their vaccine contributions and to support the poorest countries. And that just makes sense. I mean, this is a global crisis, and it's the most logical thing in the world to do global risk pooling and collaborative partnerships. And yet, it's a time when many countries don't seem willing to do that because they're so focused on their domestic needs. And we're trying to just make sure the message comes through that you can do both. You can look after the needs of your own citizens and support a global effort. And that's the smart thing to do, both for national needs and global needs.
You're right in pointing out that it's not just vaccines that we need to focus on. We'll talk about therapeutics and diagnostics in just a bit as well. And I know that there has been a disappointment on the diagnostic side. But Mark, since we were talking about risks, future product liability claims, is that going to be a crucial challenge as we move forward?
Yeah, well, that is an important discussion with the regulators, because the flip side of moving with unprecedented speed is that we are taking on some unknown risks. Let's say even with the vaccine that we're coming out, we will have done, and the regulators will make sure, including the Indian regulators, that we will have rigorous safety tests before any vaccine is approved. But one of the things by definition we won't have is tracking the long-term effects, because no single person will have had this vaccine for the long term. So you will need some degree of indemnification for companies and other sort of regulatory frameworks that give them some forgiveness, because if there were significant liabilities, that would really paralyze the infrastructure. So I want to be clear, though, we need a safety balance. I'm certainly not suggesting that things get rushed through without the properly rigorous testing, because that's so critical for public faith in vaccines and public health and just for positive outcomes. But we also need to acknowledge that, we are doing this at a pace and a speed that hasn't been done before, and there will need to be some support structures for the companies and other producers on the liability front.
Yes, this is going to be a big debate, I would imagine. But, you talked about therapeutics, Mark, and you've developed a therapeutic accelerator. You've raised about $125 million to help find treatments. What's the plan on the therapeutic side?
Yeah, so there are multiple plans, and the Therapeutics Accelerator, that money we've raised has actually been raised from a number of private philanthropists and companies, ranging from the Dow Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to MasterCard. And that's been working on a number of fronts. One has been looking at existing products that are already regarded as safe and efficacious. That's the term that we know. They've already gone through all the regulatory hurdles. They're just not approved for COVID. So we're testing to see whether some of those might actually work with COVID. Dexamethasone, which is the relatively cheap steroid that was identified in a UK trial, which we helped support, is an example of something like that, and we're constantly looking. We're also looking at trials of other products, for example, BCG, which is a vaccine for tuberculosis that's widely used around the developing world. Looks like it might have some effective priorities for protective capacity for COVID. And so we're helping conduct some tests and fund some tests to see if that works. And then we're also looking at ways in which we support the distribution of these newer drugs, the so-called monoclonal antibodies, which you may have heard about, of which there are a couple. That's what President Trump received in the United States on an experimental basis. And those do look promising. And we've actually set up a deal with one of the companies, Eli Lilly, to help produce, again, at cost, product that will be available for developing countries at the same time as wealthy countries if they get regulatory approval.
Okay, you talked about dexamethasone, BCG trials as well. There's been a lot of speculation on whether that provided a shield here in India, and monoclonal antibodies, the partnership with Eli Lilly. But let me ask you about what you make of the WHO's solidarity trials on remdesivir, HCQ, suggesting that they don't actually show beneficial results.
Yes, so that's exactly the kind of science we need on a continuing basis. That all of these are based on trials. Remdesivir got its preliminary approval on the basis of some important trials. The Solidarity trial of the UK that the World Health Organization is using is a sort of really important added framework, particularly as this goes to more and more people. We're learning as we go, and hopefully we'll get good news along with bad news all the time. There'll be some progress, there'll be some setbacks, but all of it is really underlining, again, the need to have a large, well-funded infrastructure that is able to both support the research and development, support manufacturing at scale, at risk, and do the tracking, exactly what the WHO is doing, and that's what I talked about in terms of long-term effects. As these products go out to more and more people, let's find out what the long-term results really are, and then we can adapt our response accordingly.
Mark, you spoke about the funding challenges. Is it getting harder to be able to access funds to be able to deal with COVID-19? You spoke about some of the partners that you have on board, people like Mark Zuckerberg. What role is philanthropic capital going to play in all of this?
Well, philanthropic capital and, I think the role the Gates Foundation has been able to play is the early days in January. We made our first investments in COVID way back in late January before there was a single case outside of China, is we can move quickly. We can take risks. We can fill gaps. The Therapeutics Accelerator is an example of something we were able to set up in the March-April timeframe at a time, it was just very challenging for governments to do. But what philanthropy can never do is fill the gap that the private and public sector need to. This kind of challenge of confronting COVID and confronting pandemic and health preparedness more broadly is the fundamental role of government, and it has to be supported by the innovation and strengths that private sector bring. And so while it's been great and we're proud of what the Gates Foundation has been able to do in terms of the direct response, I think it's so critical that in that phrase that's being used more, we build back better, that when we come out the other end of this crisis, we are putting in place a well-funded infrastructure that makes sure this doesn't happen again, and that we are able to both deal with the immediate problems and the long-term problems, because right now we're not raising enough money yet. I mean, it's been encouraging to see the commitments have been made to the COVAX Accelerator, but it's well short of what's going to be needed if we want to vaccinate billions of people. And so this is just the first step, and we're going to be looking for a lot more from governments in the months and into next year.
Yes, I would imagine that philanthropic capital can only play a supporting role here, that the heavy lifting will have to be done by government resources. But Mark, let me end by asking you, because so much of the focus and attention is on COVID, and rightfully so, given the fact that it is an unprecedented crisis the world is faced with. But is there a fear that we are probably going to lose some of the gains that we've made on some of the other diseases that we've been able to address in the last decade or so? Is that a fear that you have?
More than a fear. It's an uncomfortable reality that we're working to deal with. So I mentioned earlier our annual Goalkeepers report. That's a report that the Gates Foundation puts out at the UN General Assembly every year. And we started it in order to show how much progress the world has been making against the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set, and including targets like reducing child mortality, reducing extreme poverty, reducing maternal mortality, reducing nutrition. And for 20 years, the world has been making amazing progress, and India has been right at the front of that. And yet this year's report, we showed that, for example, in vaccination rates, which has been probably the biggest contributor to reduced child mortality, we had seen in just 25 weeks, vaccination rates had dropped back to rates that hadn't been seen for 25 years. We'd seen 37 million more people already thrown into extreme poverty. That's poverty of less than $1.90 a day as daily income, after nearly 2 decades of steady increases of people becoming pulled out of poverty. Now, there have been quick responses. Many of those vaccination campaigns have been resumed. India, again, has been a really good model of how to try and continue to keep ordinary public health priorities front and center, even as we're also addressing COVID. But there's no question there have been massive setbacks, and the long-term impact risks being really devastating unless we can keep that focus, because it has to be a both and. The world, and particularly the world's poor, cannot afford to be neglected because we've turned our attention exclusively to COVID. That ideally we take on the COVID response, but we also use this opportunity to build infrastructure. It can be around digital health. India, again, has been a model of how to use digital cash payments to the very poor. I think over 200 million people got emergency cash payments as a way for tiding over the COVID crisis. And that's infrastructure that's going to leave them very well equipped for the future. So we need those kind of models so that we're tackling all the wider range of development challenges, even as we remain very focused on trying to tackle COVID right now.
Well, that certainly is going to be a challenge. And yes, we do hope that even as we do battle COVID, we don't lose the gains that the world has seen on some of the other diseases. Mark, Suzman, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on the Global Dialogue to take us through what we can expect on a bunch of issues, from vaccine development to therapeutics and, of course, the battle against COVID-19. Appreciate your time, and thanks very much, as always, for joining us. We will take a break here, but don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment here on CNBC TV 18.